Fantastic. So it's very common for Cato customers or Cato partners to need to configure lots of sites at the same time. Essentially, it's common for us to ship out our socket appliances. We get the socket appliances plugged in, they're configured, and now we're ready to start configuring different interfaces and VLANs and different networks. And so one of the challenges is that if we already have existing sites there, how do we go about doing that in bulk, or how do we handle kind of more than one site provisioning at one time? So what we're going to walk through today is highlighting something that's on the Cato community here, an article that walks through step by step how to do this, Greenfield and Brownfield deployments. And this is referencing, you're more than welcome to walk through that tutorial, but this is referencing a module that is found on the Terraform registry that is for bulk site deployments. And we covered in previous videos how to set up Terraform, how to use modules, what modules are. But in this case, what we're going to be doing is referencing bulk site modules that can either deploy from a set of CSV files or from an individual JSON file, depending on the preference of data structure. So in this case, if I have this little snippet of code on how to deploy my sites from bulk, from in this case CSV files, I just need to copy this little snippet, and I'm going to be referencing this Cato management application account here under the network tab. I've only got one IPsec site deployed at the moment. So let's take this little snippet of code and jump into my IDE, or my integrated development environment. And I simply paste this module of code into my main.config. And in here, I've got my Cato provider configurations with my token and my account ID. And I've got my version referencing the version of the provider that I want from the registry, and my variables for authentication. All right, so now that I've got these two set up, the very next question is, where do I get the template for my format, or the format for my template? Here, right inside the registry, I have links to the CSV files that we can use. And the same would be true for the JSON file that I can use to configure. But we also have the option of using a different tool, the Cato CLI. And in our introduction to APIs in the YouTube series, you'll find how to set up and configure. But essentially, this is a public pip package. We also have the ability to export various things from the Cato management application, including socket sites. And in here, I can then, if I run the help menu, this will give me some different options. And one of those options is to generate a template. And so I can see the -GT gives me the option to generate templates. And if I rerun that command and I pull up my folder that I'm in here, where I've got my main file, my versions, and I run this command, it's going to generate me a series of templates. And what we find in here is a kitchen sink of one of every possible configuration option. So this is kind of a parent level file, the socket site CSV file that has all the information for my sites. And in this case, I've got a site called 1500, and I can see if I scroll to the right that I've got address information, DHCP range information, all of my site configs. And then there's also a second line here that is used to configure a second WAN interface, for example. So if I have a second line with the same site name, and doesn't have my connection, I can now configure multiple WAN interfaces from my parent level site CSV. Now, the other thing that was created in this generate template is a folder for sites config. And notice that in this case, I've got one CSV for the 4 different sites that are in my parent level site folder. And what these CSVs contain is an example of every possible variation of the type of network range that I would want to configure, and an example of how to configure an additional LAN interface. So for example, if I have a socket interface with a default LAN interface of int5, for example, on a 1600 device, and I want to configure int6, 7, and 8 with different network ranges, I simply add additional lines to this file where I can then configure those additional interfaces referenced here by the interface index and all the other configurations that I would want to import.
So every site's going to have one of these when you're creating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're going to have the master, and then you're going to have each site's going to have its own. So you have all those ranges, and then Terraform is going to take all those to do the updates into the Cato CNA, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
So what I've done here is I've created one template site that we're going to be using. And in this example, I've got a 1500 site called my 1500 site and a 1600 site, my 1600 site. And I've got my configuration information in here. And then inside of my sites config folder, I've got the exact same thing here, kind of referenced by the site name with different networks that I want to configure for my example sites, right? So let's go back into our configuration again. This is the directory that I have this in, my socket site, and then my site's config folder. Those are the two input parameters for my module. There's a couple of additional Cato CLI tools that we can use to validate our configuration ahead of time. One of the challenges is that sometimes there's a syntax issue between the city or the time zone or something along those lines. And what we can do is the Cato CLI also has some other import tools. For example, validating my site location against my sites.csv, and I'm telling it that it's a format of CSV in this case. Awesome. So now I've run my import validate command, and I do see that it found a problem. Looks like US2 was identified as an invalid country code. So if I go back over to my CSV file here, under my sites, I see that US2 is indeed a typo, which is a very common scenario for people typing in city names or things that may not align exactly to the syntax needed from the API. So this is a way for us to kind of pre-flight check our deployment, if you will. And the other thing that I can do is I can run a validate command against this API, against this CSV as well. The Cato CLI has an import command where when I import things into Terraform, I can validate that I have all the required fields, for example, for a brownfield deployment. But this is something that we can reference from the article on the community. So now essentially what I've done is I've filled out my CSV for my sites. I also have a CSV for my network ranges. So in this folder, I want to do a Terraform init. And inside of the init, what it's going to do is find that I have a module called bulk sites, and it's going to download that. And it's going to find all the nested modules that are in there as well. And then it locates the CSV files based on this configuration. If I do a Terraform plan, it's now going to tell me how many of what kind of resource that it's going to create. And I've got 27 resources in this case that it's going to create. All the different networks that I find
Each
in my
network is something
CSV.
is something that's created in that 27 count, right?
That's exactly right. So it
Okay.
finds every single one of the interfaces, network ranges, and site records, and individually creates each one of those resources for me. But I can manage that in a simple way from CSV format or JSON
I did
format.
want to call out one thing on the master template. Each line is an interface. Just did we call that out? Let's get it. So each
Mhm.
line. Okay, cool.
That's right. So the
Yeah.
first one would be the site record, which has a default WAN interface. And here we can define WAN1 as the role for the WAN interface I'm configuring with my site. I do have the option to configure a second one
Yeah.
per site as well.
And you can
So
see
this
that
is
on the top one, it's got the reference to that's the actual, connection site. And the second one, it knows. We explain that just a little bit in those lines.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
each one of these records here is a site configuration based on the presence of the connection type.
Yep.
If I have a connection type, the import assumes that this is a record for an individual site. So if I had a connection type here, these would conflict because I can't have two sites with the exact same
Yep.
name.
Yep. Yep.
But if I don't have this there, then it assumes because the site name is the same
Yeah.
that
That
this
you're
is
updating the
A WAN
interface.
interface configuration for this site. And
Okay.
so that's how we're able to, in CSV format, configure multiple WAN interfaces for one site,
Yep.
and then referencing this socket,
So
this
every line,
connection type.
every interface needs its own line.
That's correct. That's
Okay.
correct. Every
Cool.
every WAN interface needs its own line. And the same thing would apply to LAN interfaces. LAN interfaces in this example, I have the interface index. An interface index assumes that one of these exists. If I have this network range referencing int6 and this one referencing int5, int5 is actually the default LAN interface for the socket. But if I wanted to have additionals, I can configure this next LAN interfaces in six, and all of the rest of these subnets can reference this interface as well. So
Okay.
there's kind of an example convention for how
Yeah.
to create or
Yeah.
configure a new
And
LAN
you would just
interface.
delete the ones you didn't want to use in here. Let's say you just wanted to
Yep.
do. Okay, cool, gotcha.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
all
we can
right.
see that I've done just that in my second example.
Oh,
My
perfect. Yeah,
1500, I only
this
have
is
three records in here.
this would be more common
Yep.
probably.
Yep.
Okay,
This would probably be more common. Just a couple of them off a single interface, maybe,
that
or a
makes sense.
1500 that has a LAN 1, LAN
Because you
2.
might have a couple sites that have a ton of different networks and stuff, and you
Yep.
could just do that
The
in
1700
individual
might
sites.
have your expansion port or different interfaces to
Yeah,
configure. You can manage it this way.
got
So,
it. That makes sense. Cool.
mhm. And so now what I can do is I can run a Terraform apply with parallelism. Parallelism equals true. We've covered that in our setup of Terraform as well, but that's what's required for deploying with Cato using Terraform there as well. And so when I apply this, it's going to go ahead and start to create all of my sites and the 27 resources that it identified. So if I go back into my Cato management application, I can hit a refresh on this screen. It's going to start to create my sites. And then I see I now have
There we
two
go.
different entries.
That's
And
cool.
underneath the 1600, I know it's still creating here, but I can navigate down to site configuration under networks, and I see them start to populate. So let's refresh this screen, and it's in the process of configuring, in this case for my CSV, two different LAN interfaces. I see LAN 1, LAN 2, and
That's
now it's going to start to
awesome.
fill out all those network
And those
ranges
were
that I have
all
in
in
my
that
config.
spreadsheet with the detailed LAN interfaces that you had before, right? Yeah, right
Exactly.
there.
So
Okay, awesome.
here's all the spreadsheets here. Here's all the networks here that I have kind of outlined, and it's going to start adding all of these in here
That's
one at a time, including each one of my DHCP configurations and network settings. So if I keep refreshing here, it's going to keep uploading those in bulk,
yeah.
right?
That's a massive time saver. The bigger the Cato deployment you have, and if you're a partner, it allows you just to have one template that you can then use to rule them all as you do more Cato deployments. That's huge.
Absolutely. And so this is also helpful for if you have an existing set of sites and the brownfield deployment post that we have in the community walks through this. I can also export my existing site configurations, import them into Terraform, and then update. For example, maybe you need to change your DHCP range settings, or you want to modify something bulk across all your sites. This is a very straightforward, easy way to do that. Now I can
Yeah.
take all of my site configuration information, dump it into either a JSON or a CSV format, and then save that down and update them as well.
Yep. And that's all
Lastly,
in
this
that
is
document too for the Greenfield Brownfield deployment, right? Right
that's
there.
exactly
Yeah.
right.
Perfect.
And then
Yep.
lastly, it's very helpful to schedule a job to take a full backup export of all of
Oh,
your site configurations because
that's pretty
now
cool.
if anything happens, I can revert back to the
And
last
it's
known good
completely
state or I
off
can
of,
recover.
yeah, and it's completely off of Cato at that point too, right? It's
Yep.
just another layer. Wow, I didn't think
It's
about
a
that. That's really
business
cool.
continuity layer. You can then
Yeah.
version control it, and you can have an entire restore plan. Or also for, we have multiple instances of the Cato management application in Japan and India and US and Europe. You can now migrate one entire configuration over to another instance of the Cato management application and
That's
migrate
cool.
to a new region, or
Yeah.
replicate things into a dev environment to replicate exact like for like configurations in bulk. So a couple of different use cases that are very helpful.